Good afternoon and welcome to this session of the introduction of 10 new insights in climate science. Some of you might have had the chance to listen to the press conference yesterday. So for some of you, there might be some repetition, but today we will have a chance to go a little bit deeper into the discussion of what the insights mean and also give you a bit a sense of how they came to pass. My name is Peter Schlosser. I'm Vice President, Vice Provost at Arizona State University, and I'm also the director of the Julie and Wrigley Global Futures Laboratory. I will lead through this session. The session will have several segments. First, I just will put a bit of context around the 10X. Then Johan Rockström will introduce the 10 new insights. Then we have three distinguished panelists. We have Laura Pereira, Sandrine Dixson-Declève, and Carlos Nobri, who will give about 5 minutes each of their impression of what the 10 new insights mean. Then we will have a conversation with the panelists and close with question and answers moderated by Johan. So just a bit of context. This is the 7th edition of the 10 new insights in climate science. They were initially conceived by the Earth League. They are now produced and distributed by Future Earth, the Earth League, and the World Climate Research Program. Initially, the name actually was different. Johan reminds me of that here and there. Initially, it was meant or the name was the 10 must knows, and it was meant to provide some fundamental level of knowledge about the climate system for negotiators and policymakers. Then, as we moved on, we felt, yeah, there must be a learning effect in that community. So we go from must knows to the 10 new insights. As we moved along, we also felt that what initially was a summary of what the group of authors felt were the 10 new insights and their content, that this also should be vetted by the scientific community. And so we started to produce a manuscript that is being submitted each year before the launch, the official launch of the 10X, and published in Global Sustainability. So this year, the acceptance of the manuscript just happened a few weeks ago. As you might imagine, the timeline is short if you have to have a turnaround within 1 year, but the manuscript has been submitted and accepted and is now available at the website of the journal Global Sustainability. So if you want to have a full version of what went into the policy report, then you can find it there. The 10X is overseen by an editorial board of about 10 members, but the input is, and then the content is written by a larger number of scientists. This year we had 67 scientists from 24 countries. So that gives you a bit of sense of what kind of input we get and how it is actually vetted and reviewed. Um, the 10 new insights are also a final point I wanted to make, are not meant to substitute other procedures, for example, the IPCC reports. They are meant to be a nimble instrument to capture every year what has happened in the last year and to put that together in a way that is informative for those who are negotiating and those who are making decisions. So they are really a means for us to capture what is in the literature that is not older, what has been published in the literature is not older than 2 years, with focus on what came out over the year since the last publication of the 10X. So with that, let's get to the 10X for 23. And Johan will lead through that, picking out a few of them specifically, but also give you a sense of what the package as a whole is giving us this year.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. And a really good summary of what the 10 Nicks is, which actually means that this is, I mean, in the vast volume of reports released at each COP meeting, the 10 Nicks has a very special position. It really is an effort from the scientific community to offer all the negotiators who are here a really easy to read, a quick summary of the 10 most important advancements in science over the last 12 months. So at the press conference, we do actually ceremoniously hand this over to the United Nations Framework Convention and expect, in this case, Simon Steele, as head of the UNFCCC, to also hand it over and kind of reach out to all the negotiating teams here. And this year's 10 Nicks is particularly, let's say, a hot document in relation to the ongoing negotiations, because the number one is the conclusion, which is now quite well established, unfortunately, both in the IPCC and in science coming after the 2021-2022 release, that 1.5 degrees Celsius remains the climate limit that we should have as our benchmark that we're aiming for, but it's inevitable to reach 1.5 without accepting a period of overshoot. Now, this overshoot period is analyzed in the 10 Nicks. There's a lot of publication behind it. At best, we're talking about 3-4 decades of a risk of between zero point 0.1 to 0.3 degrees Celsius of overshoot, meaning that we pass through the 1.5 degrees Celsius limit sometime between 2030 and 2035 to come back to 1.5 by the end of this century. And why is this so absolutely fundamental also for the negotiations? Well, it is, of course, because the conclusion on why do we return? What is that brings us back to 1.5? Well, two criteria needs to be fulfilled, which are captured in this year's 10 Nicks. Number one is the third assessment here, that we need to have credible, large-scale scaling of carbon dioxide removal technologies, everything from CCS to carbon capture and utilization to direct air capture technologies, but also major investments in the 10 Nicks number 4 on being sober in our assessment of the role of nature climate solutions. So basically, nature and technology are the only factors that can bring us back after an overshoot period. And this gives a lot of scientific support why we also now need to talk about fossil fuel phase out as our aim for the discussions here at COP28, because of the uncertainties related to the scalability, the overshoot, and the permanence of carbon in nature climate solutions. So all of this is captured in a really sharp and a straightforward way in the 10 Nicks. Let me also single out two more of the Nicks conclusions that we have this year. So you have this package of overshoot, rapid fossil fuel phase out, and scaling of CDR, and the permanence of nature climate solutions, which are the 1 to 4. We also have on the fifth insight something that is really, really heated in the discussions right now, which is the need to recognize that the biosphere and the climate are a fully integrated system, and that interactions between what happens on the biodiversity convention work has to interact very closely with what's happening on the climate action. The drivers are the same: overconsumption, inequity, the way we run the global economy, and they are completely interdependent. So interdependent that even if we would phase out fossil fuels, if we do not address biosphere resilience properly, we will still miss out on the Paris targets or the limit of 1.5. So that is in our number 5 insight. And let me just close with a final one, which I personally find to be perhaps not a surprise, but we haven't heard much that in the discussions, which is the insight number 8 on human immobility. We have a very strong focus, rightly, how climate change and environmental change undermines livelihoods among vulnerable communities, causing risks of displacement, migration, and even being an amplifier of conflict. So this is kind of the straight line of climate impacts on displacing and moving people out of their geographic homes for livelihoods. What this insight is summarizing is the latest science showing that you have the reverse trend as well, that the most vulnerable communities, when hit by climate change, lose so much of their agency, so much of their capital, so much of their ability to rise in that crisis, that they actually get stuck as immobility being the consequence of climate change. And this is also an additional element in the whole loss and damage discussion, which is also central in the negotiations here. So I hope this gives you a bit of a flavor of what we're trying to do here to connect, place science closer to the policy debate here at the COP meeting. Back to you, Peter.
Thank you. Is the mic on? Yeah, now the mic is on. Thank you, Johan. So we will now hear from our panelists, Laura, Sandrine, and Carlos. And to save us time, I will not read through the lengthy bios that all of them have with all their accomplishment, but leave it up to them to just introduce themselves very briefly when they start to make their comments. I will start with Laura, and what they will do is they will give you their take on the 10 nicks from their own perspective, their own experience, their own field. So, Laura, back over to you.
Thank you so much for that. This is on, yes. So my name is Laura Pereira. I'm an associate professor at the Global Change Institute at Wits University in Johannesburg, South Africa. And my initial comments and insights, really that, as Johan was mentioning, this number one insight, 1.5 degrees is fast becoming inevitable. And I think that rather than seeing that as this really emotional response of, oh no, of just of giving up, of like, what is it? It should be rather seen as, how do we open up the kinds of transformative interventions that's actually going to keep us in the safe space of 1.5 degrees? It really should be a galvanize, a call to action to actually say, no, hold on a second, this is not a threshold that we want to cross. And I think some of the other insights actually give us a little bit of insight as to what it is we do need to do around that. And in particular, insight number 5 on sort of the fundamental interconnectivity between the sort of biodiversity, the biosphere, and the climate, and how we actually can't see these as separate issues. They're fundamentally connected, and we need to really start addressing these with systemic intervention. So I think that's a really important insight that I'm sure we're going to unpack a little bit more as we go forward. Insight number 9 on operationalizing justice. So this is not just a question of kind of this biophysical point that we're reaching. This impacts people's lives. It impacts people's ancestral homes in space. This is an existential threat that we're facing. And so when we're looking at more effective climate adaptation, which is going to be critical, as we say, right now, we know we're going to need to adapt over the coming decades to various different climate threats, that the justice aspect of that needs to be central in these discussions. And I think that's another really important insight. And then finally, insight number 10 is on reforming food systems, again, to contribute to just climate action. I think you're seeing a lot of the word just sort of starting to come through these insights. And I think that needs to be foregrounded. The kinds of transformations that are called for within our food system that are appropriate in different contexts, that sort of understand culture and nutritional needs, as well as sort of the environmental limits within which we set, is another big challenge that we have, but it's also an opportunity that we need to leverage in order to get ourselves onto a pathway that is not actually seeing us going into this danger zone.
Thank you, Laura. And Laura makes two important points. One is that we cannot go in view of the 1.5 from deniers to fatalists. We have to see that even if we are exceeding 1.5, we can come back to it. And, it is pretty clear that we will run through 1.5. So the question is then, as Johan already pointed out, how long will we be in overshoot and when will we come back? So that's really clear to keep in mind. So, Sandrine, what's your take on this year's 10 New Insights.
Thank you so much, Peter, and it's such a pleasure to be here. I'm Sandrine Dixson-Declève, and I am the co-president of the Club of Rome. I also chair a series of different working groups at the European level on research and innovation and the societal and economic impacts of research and innovation. This report could not be more timely, and I really think that is the key point. It's not only timely because of where we are and COP discussions and some of the outbreaks around how much of the science truly proves the need to move quite fast, in particular on the phase out of fossil energy. But it also could not be more timely in terms of the key questions that we're asking ourselves as to how we can truly decarbonize and the role of some of the solutions that we have. Every single one of the points brings out a real dilemma and discussion point that we are all facing as scientists, economists, um, leaders within the business community, and government officials. It is a report that, in particular, also brings in the juxtaposition of the need for both policy making that is tough and ambitious, but also the governance frameworks that are going to enable us to actually move forward. So I want to highlight a few key points. One is that number 2, which talks about a rapid and managed fossil fuel phase out, is underpinned by the science that is in this report and new insights. And so I urge you all to read it and also to bring it into your own discussions as we roam around the corridors of the COP. It also brings out the very important point that we've been making, myself and Johan, around the fact that COPs need to be reformed to take into consideration science, and in particular, the newest science that we have to date. There is a tendency not to inject science. In fact, some of you may know 0.5% of the participants at this COP are scientists. And that is a real difficulty. Not only are they only 0.5%, they don't have access to the negotiations and the discussions. The other key point, which is fundamental, is how do we ensure that we look at carbon dioxide removal and that it doesn't become a crutch within the negotiations for not doing what we need to do on the reduction of emissions, in particular from fossil fuel energy, and of course also from land use, and also from transport and all of the other sectoral issues that we have before us. And so maybe the last key point that I want to bring up is, as both myself and Johan are sitting on the Climate Governance Commission, that these governance issues are not just ones around how we can bring in the different negotiations, whether they be on biodiversity, on desertification, on climate, but also how do we make sure that we put in place the governance frameworks that we need? We have a big issue around geoengineering, and we know that that is going to slowly blow up. We do not have the governance frameworks that we need for that. So governance is fundamental at the international level, at the regional level, and at the national level.
Thank you, Sandrine. And Sandrine brings up a very important point that we really should keep in mind, and that is what often is shorthanded as the moral argument. And which means we are just doing negative emissions to be able to emit more. It is difficult enough to with cutting all the emissions that we can as fast as we can to get to net zero with negative emissions. So I think those who are knowledgeable will not fall into that trap. But this myth is still out there that we simply want to have negative emissions so that we can keep burning fossil fuels. So we really, I think we have to be a voice in trying to, diffuse that myth, because I'm always surprised how strong it comes up here and there again. It's just not dying away. Yeah. Carlos, what's your take? You have been part of that process since many years. So what do you think about the 23 version?
Yes, I'm Carlos Nobre from Brazil, University of São Paulo, and I've been working for more than 40 years with the Amazon. So I will raise some issues here. Particular, the new insights number 4 and 5, the near future and future contribution of natural carbon sink. And I will tell you that for the Amazon, this strategy is very risky if we do not move in that way for the Amazon. And also, of course, the interlinked climate and biodiversity emergency all over the planet, but in particular for tropical forests. So basically, we know, if you look at all the tipping points of the Earth system, the Amazon rainforest is there. It's very close to this tipping point that we call savanization. The Amazon forest evolved ecological, geological evolution over 40 million years since the Andes uplift. And really, it became the largest forest, 6.5 million square kilometers, stores 150 billion to 200 billion tons of carbon below and above the soil, has the largest biodiversity in the planet. Tremendous evolution, ecological and physical evolution of ecosystem service. For instance, recycling water very effectively increases rainfall by 50%, decreases temperature by 3 to 5 degrees. So all tropical forests behave that way, but the Amazon as well. However, we are very close to the tipping point. Why? Because we have this synergistic combination of global warming, which is inducing all over the planet, but in the Amazon, severe droughts. A long time ago, there was one severe drought every 2 decades. Now we have 2 very severe droughts every decade, 2005, 2010, 2015, 16, 2023, and we'll move to 24. That is already the record-breaking drought in the Amazon, and this is El Nino, and this is tropical North Atlantic warmer. So, and also severe droughts induce also a longer dry season. And then we have also land use change. Pastures replace more than 1 million square kilometers in the Amazon. Degraded pastures do not recycle water during the dry season. The forest recycles water more in the dry season than in the wet season. So this is the synergistic combination of more severe droughts and not recycling water in the degraded forest area. So that's why we say, and why I say we have, as I said, 1 million square kilometers of forest, another million square kilometers degraded. Why we say we are very close to the tipping point? Because the dry season in all over southern Amazon is 4 to 5 weeks lengthier in 40 years, 1 week per decade. 1 week per decade. So the biome, which is relevant if the dry season becomes 6 months, is tropical savanna. There is no tropical forest with a long dry season. So if we continue in that way, in 2 to 3 more decades, the Amazon will turn into exceeds the tipping point. That means within 30 to 50 years, 250 billion tons of carbon dioxide will be emitted, just to say. So that's why I say, this for how important is the natural carbon sink, but not only for removing CO2 from the atmosphere, but really to maintain the dry season, not to keep it becoming longer and longer. So those will be the 2 very important ecosystem services. But of course, we are talking about, and I just finished by saying, 2 days ago, Brazilian government launched a project called Arc of Restoration. So Brazil will look for big investments, $30 billion to restore 24 million hectares of these highly deforested areas in southern Amazon, and that will remove 10 to 13 billion tons of carbon over 30 to 50 years. But most importantly, the secondary forest grows very fast, recycles water very well, so that will be the way to avoid the tipping point. So I would like to make that comment for the Amazon. this number 4 is really the one, but we have to keep it, not only to removing, that would remove a lot of carbon, but it's mostly to preserve, to prevent the Amazon reaching the tipping point.
Thank you, Carlos. Very, very important message about an iconic part of the Earth system, carbon system, that often is not seen as clearly as you laid it out here. Sandrine, back to 1.5. So when in 2015 the targets were set, there were also conditions to say what does it take to get to 1.5. And sadly, we are badly behind. We are in negative time on all fronts, in emission cuts, but also in the upscaling of negative emissions. So in your opinion, will we actually be able to turn that corner? And what will it take to turn that corner?
So Peter, I don't want to bring in the doomsday scenarios, but we have to remember that the Club of Rome published its first report, The Limits to Growth, in 1972. And already in that report, it actually demonstrated that there could be the potential of a scenario where we would have 400 parts per million of carbon in the atmosphere.
Right.
And here we are, and that we would actually have tipping points in 2020s. So we don't have another 50 years. That's point number one. Can we turn the arc? Can we actually? I think that as the work that we've done with Johan and others has shown through Earth for All, a survival guide for humanity, where we have two key scenarios, the too little, too late scenario, which demonstrates that it's business as usual. And that's today's scenario. I mean, that is what we're experiencing right now, which is pushback on the reduction of fossil fuel emissions, entrenched interests in a variety of different sectors, not moving fast enough to really reach our 50% reduction goal by 2030 of emissions, and also then decades after. But we do have what we call the giant leap scenario. And the giant leap scenario very much takes into consideration every single one of these insights, which is, first of all, we need to look at land use. We must address the reform of our agricultural system and move towards regeneration. We must obviously transform our energy system, not just on the supply side, but also on the demand side. Energy efficiency is fundamental, and let's not forget that the best energy is the one you don't use. But we also, and this is something that is not reflected as much in this report, which is completely normal, but is something that was a little bit of an aha moment for us when we produced actually Earth for All, which is the social tipping points, poverty and inequality. Those two very key turnarounds in our report indicate that if we do not look at poverty and inequality, we will not actually be within our planetary boundaries. And actually, the speed of action on and change on the planetary boundaries is directly linked to the speed of action of eradicating inequality and also poverty. So I also think we get so fixated on technology, on the science, and we forget the human dimension. We forget the fact that what's blocking us as well is an over-financialized economic system that is servicing investment, first and foremost, shareholder value, and in particular profits, and not actually servicing people or planet. So we need to look at new economic indicators. And within that scenario that I'm talking about, the giant leap, we do bring in the new economic indicators. We very much look at the new financial architecture that we mean. That means debt cancellation, that means special drawing rights. We look at the science, obviously, and how you match the science with the transformation needed within our energy, our food system, our transport system, and all the different emitters that we'll need to reduce. But it is a total package of 5 key turnarounds to actually reach that giant leap.
Yeah, and Sandrine makes a very important point, which is if we are looking at the Earth system, we often are too focused on the environmental systems. And in essence, the environmental systems are under pressure because we made choices that put them there, and now they are getting back at us. So this feedback loop is sometimes not fully appreciated. And a lot of it is value systems. So talking about value systems and linking that to food systems, Laura, as we are as we all know, without a fundamental change of the food system, we cannot reach the goals that we have set for ourselves. So what is it that we can use as an incentive for people to help change that food system? Because we can change agricultural practices as much as we want if what we produce is not being accepted, if the societal acceptance is not there, we will not succeed. So what can we do to push that system to a new state?
If I had the answer, I don't think we'd be here right now. But I can definitely talk. It's exactly as you mentioned, it's value systems, right? It's what do we find aspirational? What do we aspire towards, right? And I think that's actually at the core, because if we're able to think of something different, and we were just on another panel, and I was referencing a comment made by a colleague of mine at Stockholm Resilience Center who's working with a cheesemaker in Austria, who asked, talking about food system transformation, going back to sort of local practices on what is enough. And the science shows us what is enough, right? How we allocate that is up to us. And that's where the questions of equity and justice and the types of value systems really come into play. So, what is this future planet that we want to leave? What is it going to look like in 2100, right? And we have choices to make. So, we have choices where we decide to continue to emit fossil fuels, and we can say, all right, we will go and plant trees in African savannas, right? Which we also know is not necessarily the best the best way to go about doing it, but where African nature becomes the solution for consumption elsewhere, right? And that could be, but that means that we're trading off against livelihoods, against agricultural production, against sort of cultural connections to place, to biodiversity, megafauna, right? That's what we're then willing to sacrifice. That's then what we're willing to lose in that kind of a scenario. Or we can think through and try and identify, and this is the hopeful side, not the despair side, of where are the examples of value systems, of knowledge systems that actually do know what is enough, that are fundamentally connected to the biosphere. So this doesn't become just a question of 1.5 degrees, which is critical, but it becomes an entire way of being in place. And I think that's the transformation that we need. And if we start to get that right, then the food system will be transformed into something sort of much more sustainable, much more equitable, much more just. But it's not just the food system, it will be our transport systems, it'll be our social systems. It's how we connect to each other. You don't see poverty and inequality in that kind of a future world, right? Because we've fundamentally reconfigured how we live with the planet and with each other. And we've got examples. We've got the concept of buen vivir. We've got the concept of Ubuntu. We've got the concept of Kaitikaranga in Maori. And I think that's what we really need to go. And we talk about the need for these radical transformations. And we keep on talking about radical transformations. And I think we're all sick and tired of saying we need transformative change. But the point is, we do need transformative change if we're going to leave any semblance of a livable planet for those of us who might still be here in 2070, but for future generations after 2100. And I think that's the value system change that's linked to the food system transformation question, that's linked to the adaptation justice question, that's linked to the biosphere question, and which is connected to all the initial insights around sort of the other kinds of mechanisms or tools that are available to us around the climate crisis.
So we know that value systems have this feature that they sometimes persist through generations. We don't have that much time. Given that, but also given the fact that we are staring into the face of what you could call planetary crisis more directly year after year, are you optimistic that we will turn the curve?
That's to Laura or you?
Yeah, to Laura. All of you. Laura can start.
I work on preferable futures, desirable futures, sitting on the IPBES task force on scenarios and models and various other work. So we're like, if we close our eyes, how does it look if we get things right? And it's becoming increasingly hard to do that. But I also know that myself, my colleagues, my friends' kids who are just being born, I mean, we're going to be here given current lifespans in the next 40, 50 years? Like, what do I want to see that world look like? So we have to have hope, because without hope, what are we? And I think that what we have right now is actually a crisis of the imagination. And I think if we could reconfigure, rewire our imaginations, our aspirations, our hopes, and our dreams, that can be a really powerful leverage point for change. And it's that keeps me going and keeps on working on this and keeps me saying, we can still do it. We can still actually achieve these goals. We can still have a livable, thrivable planet. So yes, maybe I'm an optimist, but I think I have to be.
Sandrine?
Yeah, I want to build on that because we have a very recent crisis of imagination, which is we can't even imagine that we transformed during COVID, and we did. This is what actually finds me quite baffled at how quickly we forget. We completely transformed our lives for 3 years, not for the right reasons, but we did. We saw new innovations. We saw governments coming together in solidarity to protect the majority of the people and population within their jurisdictions. We actually saw people coming together and making sacrifices, which at that time didn't feel like a sacrifice because you knew it was the only way to survive. We need to learn in this and deeply and go into our subconscious and realize that transformation is feasible. We did it, and not forget that, so that we can get back into imagining how do we actually avert further crises, because we will have more and more upon us. And I think that's where you need both a reality check, which makes you freak out, cry, anxious, but then build from that sense of hope that actually humanity can be wise, can come together, can think through crises, and can actually do the right things if governments are willing to stand up to the plate. And I think that is key. It's both maybe the crisis of imagination, it's also the crisis of leadership.
And COVID is a great point, and I don't want to deflect too much, but saying I'm not a fatalist myself either. But what really was disappointing to me under COVID was we lost 15 million people roughly globally, and we normalized death. We were willing to accept death for some comfort that was more important to us than what we could have accepted, such as vaccine denial, etc. So we have to see how that plays out for us. Carlos, are you an optimist, or how are you looking at?
Well, my generation was our generation was the generation who decided or found the science. We show the risks, everything, but my generation did not do anything to change. So, but I'm more optimistic because I can see the younger generation. They are more open to radical changes in behavior. You're talking about the reforming food systems. 65% of all deforestation in the tropical forest, this is livestock farming.
Yeah.
Uh, consuming beef is doing a lot of things, including very bad for our health, excessive beef consumption. So, but I'm becoming more optimistic that the new generation, they have more power, perhaps in a few years, not 50 years, but 1 decade, to start really moving towards radical transformations in everything. Uh, Energy consumption, food systems, protecting the biodiversity, respecting all the indigenous people, local communities all over the planet. So I would say I'm more optimistic now.
Yeah, I would say I probably surprise you a bit here because I'm a nervous system scientist, spending all my time a bit just like Carlos here, bro, on the negative news. But I'm also, to be really clear, I'm very optimistic. And the reason why I'm optimistic is what creates, to be honest, a sense of anger and frustration. Because I'm not talking about hope anymore, because it's not like our scientific diagnostic is coupled to some utopian fantasy. We have the solutions, we can accelerate. Not only that, we know that sustainability accelerated gives better outcomes for social, economic, security, health, peace. Essentially, any parameter that we value gives better outcomes. So currently, It's rather frustration than being negative or optimistic. And I think we have to, just as Sandrine points out, just step back a few steps. And I think we can take many more examples than just what happened during COVID. Chancellor Olaf Scholz, when Putin invaded Ukraine, stepped up immediately and talked about the Deutsche Zeitenwende. Basically, since the wall fell down, Germany went into one mode of operation, and then suddenly they could just turn around 180 degrees and step up to the challenge of really being a solidarity support for Ukraine. We have many discussions today with the private sector saying that put a global price on carbon somewhere between 100 and 300 US dollars, and we turn this around in 5 years. We can decarbonize so fast if we just decide to do it. The global car industry is on a race to zero. Actually, most of the car industries today, the CEOs, they don't care so much about the planet. They care about the survival of their companies, because they will be outcompeted if they don't go to electric mobility basically over the next decade. So we're talking about so many solutions which are many times outside of the incremental linear pathway, but there's no excuse anymore. All the science is there. We have a crisis. We have a win-win story when we come out on the other end, and we simply need to bring that up front in all the discussions, not least when we're here gathered in Dubai. So I think it's a really a story of optimism, and it's more that it's kind of peppered by frustration and anger and disappointment. And that, to me, is not the difference between hope or unhope. It's really just a question of, are we going to take our responsibility?
Thank you, Johan. Before we go to question and answers, I would like to ask each of you, what's your view about this recent statement that seems to have opened a debate about science or the role of science in determining what pathway or which actions we should take? Do you think that this was just an anomaly and will go away? Or was that a trigger that now will be with us for a certain period of time and costs additional energy to what we have to do anyway to move towards what our actual goal is? And let's start with Sandrine.
Great, I get the hot potato first. I don't think this is just a glip. I think this is a series of continuous backlash that we have had against science, not only climate denialism, but for throughout history. We have had those who have claimed that whatever science comes out is false, not factual, or doesn't reflect their theory of change and their own science. I do believe, however, that we're now coming to a point where we can't allow this to happen anymore. There is enough sound science to demonstrate from across a variety of different scientists, from a multidisciplinary perspective, that actually climate change is upon us, that we have to massively reduce and move towards net zero emissions, that the main emissions that must be reduced are linked to fossil energy, and that therefore it is the responsibility of the producers, both the extraction and the burning, that must actually be taken into account. So, what happened yesterday, which interestingly enough blew up just a few hours before this incredible report was released, is a reminder to all of us that we cannot lose sight of the ball. This is the greatest existential risk that we have ever faced. And therefore, we must claim back the rights of science, but also our own human rights. And I think it's very important to remember that. So this is not just a glip. We will have more. There will be a buildup from this. I'm going to leave with one very important statistic that you can carry with you as you leave this room. The loss and damage fund that was set up on the first day of this COP hailed as a success, which to some degree is, started at 400 million. Oil and gas profits per day are at 1.2 billion. That is the difference. So this science issue, in particular linked to fossil fuel energy, for me is incredibly problematic because it demonstrates that we are enabling a continuing profiteering with a denialism of the importance of actually stopping that profiteering and those emissions. And at the same time, we are enhancing energy poverty across the globe and deep suffering.
Thanks, Sandrine. Sandrine actually triggered me to add a little bit to the question, and that is, as scientists, do we have to change the way we behave, the way we project, the way we move within society? So, Carlos, what's your take about that question of what the impact of what we heard yesterday will be?
Well, I think, I see more positive roles of science because I think all of us we are becoming responsible advocates, not on political parties, but responsible advocates. And we are being much more effective now than, let's say, 30 years ago to communicate science to politicians. For instance, in the Amazon, we had, for the first time ever, in the Amazon Countries Summit in August, the final declaration, they said 4 times the Amazon is very close to a tipping point. And they declared they will get to zero deforestation before 2030. So first time ever that happened. So I think I'm more optimistic that the political world is paying more attention to us.
Thanks, Carlos. Laura.
I think science already has changed the way it does business. If I look at my generation of scientists who was trained in a very interdisciplinary fashion, which was not about my role is to give you the figures and then that's sort of where it stops, right? I don't need to translate it. I don't need to make sure you understand it. I don't need to, and I think that shifted into also what does the science show us in terms of the solution space. Johan was mentioning we have the solutions available. And I think the science is also showing that. I think the other really important shift that has happened is also a recognition of the diverse types of science or research that's critically important, and then extending into the diverse types of knowledge systems actually that we need to take with us. And I think the shift of not just interdisciplinary science, but recognizing natural and increasingly social science. We were talking about, it's not about understanding. I mean, we really critically do need to understand what's happening in the biophysical realm, right? Sort of understanding what the numbers are, where these potential tipping points, these threats are. That's fundamentally important, but also understanding how people work, how economies thrive, where profits are being made, who the we is that is driving this, right? Unpacking that in a critical way. It's not a neutral term. Understanding the different knowledge systems, different ways of being and seeing and living in the world that we really need to be able to drive on. That's also important information that we need to take. And I think we're starting to see that in these kinds of platforms. We're seeing it recognized. And I think our role as researchers, as people are able to sit on these panels, is to lift that up and to be able to showcase it for the important role it really has. And I want to end with potentially as taking on the banner of that next generation of action, which is what we need to do, is that I think we're also seeing that I don't just need to be a scientist, I can also be an activist. And that's controversial in many fields. But I think increasingly there's a role that we're seeing ourselves place because it's an activist for the science. It's embedded in what we know is going to happen. And I think if we aren't also taking that mantle on, we're we're not going to be able to live with ourselves going forward.
Thank you. So our role is changing. And Johan, do you think that academia, the primary knowledge producer for society, is moving fast enough into that domain where we are not just producers of knowledge and wait till it's being picked up, but where we are much more active in not just moving forward, training new profiles, but also promote the science?
Yeah, no, I I tend to be with Carlos here. I mean, we've in the scientific community we've become so much better at engaging with stakeholder society and at being offering our services, so to say, to policy, business, communities across the world. But we can do better for sure. I mean, I remain continuously self-critical that if I would go out on the street in Berlin or in London or in New Delhi and ask about 1.5 degrees Celsius, and I would probably be lucky if I found anyone who know what I was talking about. So of course we have much more to do. But just an example, I think in 30 minutes or perhaps within an hour, the science statement responding to Sultan Al Jaber's mistake yesterday is going to hit. We are aiming for BBC, but keep an eye on it. It will be hopefully right across the entire COP28 here, where we're making absolutely clear that there's ample scientific evidence that we need to cut emissions by half every decade, phase out fossil fuels, and have a net zero world economy from 2050 onwards. That is the charge. That's what science says, referring to IPCC and to all the IEA and the central bank studies of the latest scenario that we've run. So that is, but I must admit that for many of us in academia, that is stepping out of our comfort zone. You know, we're measured by the number of peer-reviewed publications that we put out and the education and teaching that we carry out at universities. So, of course, this is an uncomfortable position, but I would strongly argue to close this, Peter, that over the last 10 years, the reason why you see scientists engaging with, for example, the whole planetary emergency agenda, everything that has to do with the climate crisis, it's stepping out of our comfort zone, way outside of where we feel comfortable, and it's acting on the evidence that we're sitting on. It's really stepping up. We're getting nervous, seriously nervous. And I mean, I interact with Carlos. I have such a privilege of doing that so frequently. But even every time I meet you, there's an update to be given to each other, and we sink one step lower in terms of, oh my God, 2023. You know, you may have seen the Bill Ripple et al. Paper on the state of the climate system 2023. It comes out every year, published in Bioscience. The 2023 version is shocking because the word shocking is used in the text. We've never seen the off the charts observations as in 2023 in the ocean, in the ice sheets, in the ecosystems, on air temperature, 50 degrees Celsius plus. Or did you have 40 degrees? Tell the story in Arizona.
We,
You don't need that.
yeah, I don't need that. Well, this year we actually had 31 consecutive days with temperatures above 110. 110, for those who like to think in Celsius, is 43.3 Celsius. So that actually was not just surpassing the previous record, it was obliterating it because the previous record was 18 days. And this was so hot that some of the native, signature plants like the saguaros just tipped over. And that was not a lack of water, which it usually is. It was just they could not take the heat.
At the same time, in Belgium and Northern Europe, we had the wettest month and the hottest month. So in October, we had the hottest month on record across many countries in Northern Europe. And in November, we have now had the most record amount of rain and humidity, in particular in the Northern Europe, but in many other countries as well. So in a 2-month period, we had both extremes.
And that's the flickering that you get when you have a state change. So we are in the middle of that. So let's take the last period of that thing, 5 minutes. Sorry that we got that long. For questions from the audience. There are 1, 2, 3, 4. Clea, can you feel them? Oh, there you are.
Yeah. Uh, First of all, thank you for your speech. It was as a puzzle for me, and I have more or less holistic vision what you are told about. I'm Anna Kirilenko from Kyrgyz Republic, and I just would like to talk about point 5 of agenda. I think point 5 of highlights. It's super important for us, and I just would like to draw attention for the online roundtable, which was organized by Club of Rome in this year in January. This roundtable was focusing on biotic regulation concept. It depends on this concept that just a wild nature ecosystem can create climate, can support climate. But nowadays we're focusing mostly just for one cycle, CO2 cycle, but depend on planetary boundary concept. We see several problems with nitrogen cycle, with phosphorus cycle, and so on. And if we get together all this cycle, we see the main problems is a nature ecosystem. We destroyed the nature ecosystem, but this is a huge factory of life. And I just would tell thank you for this point from your side, for Club of Rome, for Professor Nobre, and for you. Thank you.
Thank you for that comment. There were questions over there, actually.
Thank you so much. I will be very quickly. I'm Elena Maslova, founder of sustainability media production company Dobrosfera. And I just would like to comment that the crisis of imagination is a very big point really right now. And the solution could be we should focus on human awareness about ourselves as human beings, because we know a lot about technologies, but we don't know maybe so much about ourselves. It's a huge universe. So maybe arts could be here the solution, and communication strategy, win-win communication strategy. We should show people how to relate to each other and to the nature. Thank you.
But, I think these are let's take a few because they are mainly comments. They are not really questions. Let's see where we are getting to.
Asin Zia, Professor of Public Policy and Computer Science at University of Vermont and Director of Institute for Environmental Diplomacy and Security. I do work in impact assessment modeling and as well as natural human system space. And the question that it really bothers me is that global climate models that IPCC uses does not have human behaviors and policy and governance embedded in them. We've been trying to work on those, and I was wondering that these insights that we have generated, to what extent do they include the failures of including social tipping points and policy tipping points into those models? Can we move forward on that? For example, one of the social tipping points that we've been working on, for example, climate change-induced drought in Syria or other in Amazon basin can lead to migration, which can lead to political tipping points in EU, for example, the rise of populism, fake news, which in turn can lead to changes in the regimes, for example, the rise of populist leaders. Sorry for a long question, but I just wanted to make sure that you understand the intent of my question in terms of like the cataclysmic tipping points that we're sitting on, the cascading interactions of tipping points. How can we include those and bring about to the attention of the policymakers? Thank you.
You know, as you are working in that area, I'm sure you are perfectly aware that the social domain is the most complex part of the complex system. So that's part of it. The other part is that we did simply not pay enough attention to that area, but I think the awareness is rising, and you will see more activity in that field. There were other questions on the left.
Hello, my name is Rayad Fazani. I work in carbon capture and renewable energy. I'm looking at the 10 insights and I'm thinking which of these will actually cause the investment community to transform the way they allocate capital to actually accelerate a lot of the actions we need.
Who wants to take this one? Sandrine?
So actually, I don't think the disconnect is between these and whether or not the investment community will actually transform. I think the disconnect is in the signals that we're actually getting from the market, which is saying profit, profit, profit. What we've seen now actually is the investment community is going back to big oil and back to gas. We've got carbon bombs that are happening right now across most of our major banks. They had declared that they would actually follow the science-based targets. Some of them are actually pulling out right now as we speak. So it is the system that continues to actually push over financialized economies that enables shareholder value to dictate actually how our markets function that is the problem. And unless we change that, it's not these that are going to make a difference. It's the fact that we are wired continuously to shift capital to where the profit is, rather than to think about the planetary boundaries, which some funds are now starting to integrate, actually, planetary boundaries thinking, as well as obviously ESG and in particular social values as well. But so I'm sorry to be a little bit blunt on that question. Maybe I can just quickly make a remark for the other two. The other question, which I think is fundamental, is around modeling and also how we look at social tipping points. In particular, system dynamic modeling is exactly what got us to understanding some of the key social tipping points. And it is the feedback loops as well that we need to think about. So you're absolutely right. How do we ensure that we continuously have those feedback loops, that we bring in both the social shifts and tipping points? I mean, we cannot forget that all of the granularity of the impacts that we see will have those feedback loops at a much broader level continuously. The migration element is actually one that we're feeling right now, and we are not even speaking about inner regional migration from, for example, southern Spain to northern Spain or to northern Europe. That is not even being talked about. So we need to look at all of those different impacts and their interrelationship. And the final point on culture, you're absolutely right. And culture is also part of the narrative. And the narrative of bringing people on the journey has to be how we can communicate by using culture, by using mixed media, by using the way in which we feel emotion, whether it be through sound and music, whether it be through theater, whether it be through dance, whether it be through expression in a variety of different ways. But it also is about how we learn to better communicate and use language to bring people on a journey. And that is absolutely fundamental too. And that is something that we tried to do through Earth for All. We knew that communicating that we needed a giant leap and that the too little too late scenario is actually today was going to be tough. So we did it through the lives of 4 women. We thought about how we used language in order to communicate that better.
Perfect last comment. Oh,
No, just
Carlos,
a brief
quickly,
comment
yeah.
about what you're saying. I think, perhaps 2024, I would suggest one of the new insights in climate would be the social political tipping point, particularly because all of us are so concerned. When you ask people across the world, 75% of the people in Brazil, 90% are very concerned about climate change. However, we are electing politicians which are deniers. So, I think it would be interesting to have one more. What would be the risks if we continue electing politicians which are deniers?
Great point. And with that, we are over time. Thank you all for staying. Thanks to thank